As part of implementing due diligence, doing the research and making sure that our systems are safe, we're probably going to do some threat modeling, which involves identifying potential vulnerabilities or real vulnerabilities, and then putting in the countermeasures and controls in place so that those vulnerabilities are not exploited, causing loss. And the actual implementation of the solutions to help protect against that loss would be the due care that we're implementing. And in threat modeling, we have several different approaches we can take. One is we can take the approach of looking at it from the attacker's perspective. So let's say out here we have our attacker on the internet, and we could focus from his or her perspective on their goals and their abilities and what they could possibly do regarding our data and our systems. And another thing we also want to consider, though, is that this attacker may not be on the outside. If they've already gotten to the inside or to a portion of our network, they may be operating from there, or we could have an insider threat who's attempting malicious activity from the inside of the network. So in any case, one approach to our threat modeling might be from the attacker or potential attacker's perspective or point of view. Another possibility would be to approach it from an architecture perspective. Okay, we've got web servers here, we've got email servers, we have printers and laptops and wireless devices, and routers and switches and infrastructure. We have internal servers, we know what data is on those servers, and then we can take a look at each one of those elements from an architecture perspective and take a look at the individual vulnerabilities that could be associated with each of those individual components. And then, if we identify vulnerabilities, put in the countermeasures or protections that help mitigate the risk associated with an attacker exploiting those vulnerabilities. And the third general approach could be just to focus on the assets. Like we know we have critical data here and we have critical data here, and then identify a potential hacker. What's their motivation to get to those resources? How valuable would it be to that attacker? How much work would be involved, which is referred to as the work factor for an attacker to compromise those systems. And the reality is, the harder it is, the more difficult, the more work it is for an attacker to compromise a system, the more likely that attacker is to move on to an easier target. And in most organizations, we are going to approach it from all three of those perspectives, from the attacker, from the asset, and based on our architecture and where the data is. And we'll consider along the way the motivation, the difficulty, and also how we would detect if there was a potential attack or an existing attack that was underway. How would we detect it and identify it? And if there is an attack, how resilient are we? What's the resiliency factor about having that attack happen and having us survive it? So if we're going through our logs periodically on our firewall and we see some malicious looking activity, those could be referred to as artifacts of an attack that already happened. That could be referred to as an IOC, an indicator of compromise, that something negative already happened. Now, if the attacker is trying various things but not having success, or the attack is currently underway but it hasn't completed yet, that could be an indicator of attack, IOA. And it's always better to identify an attack before it happens or as it's happening, as opposed to simply recognizing it after it happened. Because over here, we can be more proactive and hopefully stop the attack with our countermeasures before it becomes devastating to our organization. And many organizations are not just going to rely on their own tools and techniques to protect against attackers and malicious activity. They're going to use intelligence up from the cloud. So lots of vendors, including vendors such as Palo Alto and Checkpoint and Cisco and others, are going to use threat intelligence information from the cloud to dynamically update their perimeter devices as a preemptive strike. So if there's an attack that's starting to be launched from a certain block of addresses or from a certain country, that information, as the sensors on the internet and other companies are fed to the cloud, which would be information sharing, that intelligence can then be distributed to that vendor or those vendors' products, which can increase on our perimeter devices and our next generation firewalls and IPS devices the amount of restriction or caution that that device will take with any of that traffic coming in from those source IP addresses. And it just doesn't apply to IP addresses. There also could be new updates and new attacks that are being continually discovered. And with threat intelligence, that information can be fed to our organization, to our devices, to provide better protection. So the more information we get through threat intelligence, through shared services, the more secure our systems will potentially be, which also equates to higher resiliency, because we're watching out for certain types of attack or certain types of malicious code that we otherwise, without threat intelligence from the cloud, may not have recognized. There's also data that we can gather from open source intelligence, or for short, OSINT, which is information pulled from public sources but can be consolidated and made available. And open source intelligence is used by lots of organizations, including security organizations. Another resource that we can turn to is an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC, which is a great way to help get a head start on threats that are pending or potential threats so we can protect against those threats either dynamically or through manual controls before they come to the borders of our networks. And here's a real-time threat map courtesy of Kaspersky Labs. And this is a great example about how we can take data from multiple places and consolidate that to get a better overall picture of what's going on. So an attack or malicious activity, whether it's web related or it's email related or anything else that's malicious, if we're consolidating that information and then feeding it to other devices, including antivirus and intrusion prevention systems, intrusion detection systems, and next generation firewalls, the cool thing is that multiple devices can benefit from that information, even though those specific devices have not yet experienced those specific attacks. And with the threat intelligence, they'll now be ready and better prepared to mitigate and resist those types of attacks. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.